Good afternoon, Dean Fisher, Dean McConnell, faculty, students, and distinguished guests, and welcome to False Positives, the current state of performance-enhancing drugs in sports. This past October, the Sports and Entertainment Law Society welcomed over 30 distinguished panelists in an event entitled Reversing Field, Examining Commercialization, Labor, and Race in 21st Century Sports. Over the span of 2 days, our panelists discussed and debated numerous topics relating to the current state of professional and collegiate sports. One such panel focused on the use and effects of performance-enhancing drugs and their prevalence in the industry. In light of Senator Mitchell's report released this past December, focusing on the widespread use of steroids in baseball among some all-star caliber players, and the recent congressional hearing centered around arguably one of the best pitchers ever to play the game in Roger Clemens, the issue has again come to the forefront of America's pastime. Though opening day has come and gone without much fan disinterest, there is no doubt about the prevalence of the issue in the sport. Just this past Friday, Major League Baseball and the Players Union agreed to amend the sports drug testing policy for the third time in 4 years. In addition to revising the current program by increasing the number power of the administrator, the agreement set forth the consequences for those players named in the Mitchell report. Though they will not be punished, those active players named in the report will be forced to perform community service to educate young people about the effects of performance-enhancing drugs. Though active players are virtually unscathed, the same may not be true for team officials who turned a blind eye to using in the clubhouse. It is yet to be seen just what the future holds for the sport, but it is virtually certain discussions surrounding performance-enhancing drugs will remain a part of the future. From Jose Canseco's books to testimony in front of Congress, the topic is as hot as ever, and today we are extremely lucky to have 3 distinguished gentlemen to discuss this topic with us. Moderating our discussion today will be Stacey Evans. Stacey is a third-year law student from Commack, New York, and is currently president of the Sports and Entertainment Law Society. Stacey graduated cum laude from Syracuse University in 2004 with a degree in Communication and Rhetorical Studies. In addition to working for the NBA in New York City this past summer, Stacey has interned for the NBA Coaches Association, ABC Sports, and the Yankees Entertainment and Sports Network. At this time, I will just turn our discussion over to Stacey.
We are fortunate to have with us today 3 very dynamic panelists, Professor Andre Douglas Pond Cummings, Larry Silverman, and Jay Reisinger. We have brought these gentlemen together to discuss and debate a very current issue in the world of sports. Recently, allegations have been flung at the NFL regarding the widespread use of performance-enhancing drugs. The start of the Major League Baseball season has been clouded by Senator George Mitchell's investigation into the use of steroids and the many current players who were named in this report. Andre Douglas Pond Cummings is a professor of law at West Virginia University College of Law. In his time at WVU, Professor Cummings has twice been named by the third-year students as Professor of the Year. His extensive scholarship focuses on the areas of sports, securities, and race. Before joining the faculty at WVU, Professor Cummings spent time as a visiting professor at Syracuse University's law school. Prior to entering academia, Professor Cummings worked in Chicago at the law firm of Kirkland & Ellis. A former registered NFL agent, Professor Cummings earned his Juris Doctorate from Howard University's law school. Larry Silverman is the Vice President and General Counsel for the Pittsburgh Pirates. In this capacity, Mr. Silverman assists in contract negotiations, arbitration cases, and other player-related matters. With the release of Senator Mitchell's steroids report, Mr. Silverman has been reviewing the new drug policy set in place by Major League Baseball. Prior to joining the Pirates organization, Mr. Silverman spent 21 years as an attorney for the Pittsburgh law firm of Dickey, McCamey, and Chilcote, P.C. Mr. Silverman received his Juris Doctorate from Duquesne University School of Law. Jay Reisinger is a partner at Dreyer LLP, where he focuses his work on sports law and criminal defense. Mr. Reisinger earned his Juris Doctorate from Ohio Northern University School of Law, where he graduated Order of the Coif. Mr. Reisinger is currently providing legal counsel to Major League Baseball players that were named in the Mitchell steroid report, Most recently, Mr. Reisinger served as counsel to Andy Pettitte, the New York Yankees pitcher accused of using HGH. In 2005, Mr. Reisinger advised Sammy Sosa during the U.S. House of Representative Committee's congressional hearings on steroid use in Major League Baseball. At this time, I will turn things over to our first speaker, Professor Cummings.
Thank you, Stacy. I'm delighted to be here today, and I'm fortunate to share this panel with Mr. Silverman and Mr. Reisinger. I'm looking forward to vigorous discussion, perhaps some debate, and I view my role here today as setting the table for these two men to discuss the work that they're engaged in constantly and daily. I would like to thank the Sports and Entertainment Law Society here at the law school, particularly Stacey Evans, the soon-to-be outgoing president of the organization. I'd also like to thank my research assistant, Brian Hooper, who helped in putting these remarks together, and for the support we've received from Brian Caudill and the administration here at the law school. I imagine many of you here probably watch SportsCenter or Fox Sports Net or some sports-related television highlight show each night. If I were to ask each of you, or perhaps any average sports fan, what story has dominated the airwaves in the past year in Major League Baseball, I'm sure most of you would say performance-enhancing drugs or the use of steroids by athletes. Names like Roger Clemens, Barry Bonds, Jose Canseco, Brian McNamee, Andy Pettitte, not to mention Marion Jones, have dominated the news. And highly publicized hearings before Congress have captured America's attention. In 2004, while teaching our sports law class here at the College of Law 4 years ago, the subject of steroids and performance-enhancing drugs dominated our semester. When I taught the class 2 years later, 2006, steroids and performance-enhancing drugs dominated the semester. I imagine in 2009, when we teach the class next time, that steroids and the use of performance-enhancing drugs are going to dominate discussion in the semester. Before we get into why elite athletes actually use these drugs and break the law in so doing, I'd like to ask each of you a question. Many of you here are law students. So those of you that are law students are engaged in the competitive nature of being ranked in your class and performing against your colleagues. If you became aware of a pill that would absolutely give you an intellectual advantage over your colleagues, and you knew that you would perform better taking it, would you do it? Question number 2. While knowing that this pill allowed you a superior performance over your classmates, but you knew that the pill would also give you terrible mood swings, acne on your back, shrink your testicles if you're a guy, would you still consider using it? Now, what if this pill that gave you an intellectual advantage over your classmates were made illegal against the law, subject to some fines and prison time? Would you still consider using it? And then finally, let me ask you this. If you knew that this pill would give you an advantage and you knew that your classmates were using it, that you were ranked number 6 and you knew number 5 and number 4 and number 3 were using it, or you just had a sense that those around you were using it, would you consider using the drug? I submit to you today that contrasting legal academics with sports is that there is such a drug available for athletes that gives athletes an advantage, a performance-enhancing advantage over their colleagues. The benefits, if you will, I don't know if benefits is the right word, but the benefits if you use steroids are fairly common knowledge. Anabolic steroids are synthetically produced variants of the naturally occurring male hormone testosterone. So essentially taking steroids increases your body's output of testosterone, which gives greater muscle mass, greater power, and greater strength. Steroids can be taken orally, they can be injected intramuscularly, or they can be rubbed into the skin when in the form of gels or creams. These drugs are often used in patterns called cycling and stacking. Cycling involves taking multiple doses of steroids over a specific period of time. stopping for a period of time, starting again. The negative side effects we know of. They're well documented. For men, there's a effect that include reduced sperm count, development of male breasts, shrinking of the testicles. Women often experience some masculinization, facial hair growth, deepened voice, breast reduction, menstrual cycle changes. And the continued use of steroids are thought to increase acne, bloated appearance, rapid weight gain, clotting disorders, liver damage, premature heart attacks and strokes, elevated cholesterol levels, and weakened tendons. Sounds like nasty stuff. But there is a alleged use in sports that some suggest is rampant. Others suggest that it's a few bad apples that use these drugs in sports. But I wanted to talk about two things. One is I wanted to talk about how steroid use enhances or benefits athletes' performance. And then I wanted to talk about the temptation. Why would an athlete use these drugs? And then finally I wanted to talk about the law that makes illegal the use of steroids. First of all, steroids make you faster, stronger, and able to increase workouts without overtraining. Those athletes who choose to use steroids believe the benefits far outweigh the risks. Testosterone leads to increased muscle mass and increased power and strength. Human growth hormone slows down the aging factors and increases the ability to recover, muscles to recover from overuse. One of the main arguments that I hope that Mr. Silverman and Mr. Reisinger get into today is that non-users of steroids are basically given three undesirable choices, those that choose not to use steroids. One is to lose out to the biologically enhanced. One is to quit the game or imperil their bodies by becoming users themselves. The Mitchell Report pushes this argument a little deeper. In an age of biotechnical enhancements, many athletes feel constrained by the fact or by the belief that it's impossible to compete or to compete on an equal playing field without them. The choice to forego performance-enhancing drugs amounts to, in the minds of some athletes, unilateral disarmament, virtually guaranteeing that only those taking biological advantage will succeed. These are arguments. In the steroid era, the pressure to use drugs has certainly been widespread, but it's felt especially by the marginal players, by not the superstars, the less gifted, those that have to work harder to attain or to move up. So I wanted to make this temptation for you a little starker. As Stacy mentioned in the introduction, I represented a handful of National Football League athletes during their careers in the NFL. Let me give you two very stark examples. In college, let's say you're an offensive lineman, and you're a big guy, 6'3", 6'4", 250, 270, and in this day and age, we know offensive linemen are typically 300 pounds or more, and when you line up to block that defensive end, the one that you know, because you've seen him or you've heard, is using drugs, you know is going to beat you around the edge. Do you get beat around the edge? What do you do what can you do to compete with that player? Do you take the drug yourself? Do you work out harder? Do you compete? Do you lose your job? One of the things that these athletes that I represented felt was that they were competing against folks that were enhanced and that they were not able to keep up if they did not enhance themselves. And the stark contrast of presentation is as simple as lining up against someone on the other side, knowing that they're enhanced by steroids or performance-enhancing drugs. Do you decide to be clean, to obey the law, and get beat, and perhaps lose your job, and perhaps lose your dream of playing in the league, or do you take drugs? That's one sort of stark example that these athletes face. And it's even more, my opinion, and when we get to Q&A, I'll be very happy to hear opposing opinions if you have them. My opinion in the NFL is that, as you all know, each team has a roster of 53 players. So that's 30 teams, 53 players. You have a finite number of athletes that can play in the NFL. The last Sunday before the regular season starts, each team cuts 10 to 15 players to get down to the 53-man roster. So on the last cut of the preseason, you have 300 to 350 athletes that are floating around that almost made the team. And my own belief is that you take away the 10 or 15 stars on each team, most of the athletes between number 20 and 53 and the 350 that get cut on the last day of the season are pretty interchangeable. Breaks, opportunities, coaches, very little, in my opinion, separates player 20 from player 53 and the 350 or so that get cut on the last day of the season. What makes the difference for making that team? What is the edge? What is going to make that difference? So that's one consideration. The other consideration is that human growth hormone is known to increase healing and to increase your ability to heal, to get back on the field. In the competitive nature of college athletics and the hope that you're going to reach that brass ring of playing in the NFL or Major League Baseball and making the kind of money that you know is available. And we as, the salary cap continues to increase, the ability to spend money on salaries continues to increase. Getting back on the field is key. I didn't represent Brett Favre, unfortunately. Neither did I represent Junior Seau. But I represented some guys that were sweating on that last Sunday of cuts. And these guys were marginal players. And most of my guys were clinging on to their jobs. Long snappers, backup offensive linemen, backup linebackers, guys that played on special teams. They were clinging to their jobs by their fingernails. And when they got hurt, they were desperately afraid that it was done. That if they did not get back on the field the next Sunday, that another long snapper would be brought in or another backup linebacker would be brought in and their career would be done. And so my guys, none of my guys that I know of knowingly injected or took steroids, but they were tempted by it every single time they got banged up. And any of you that have played football know you get banged up every time you play. And those are the two stark temptations that I wanted to put in front of you. Do you get beat by that guy on the other side of the line? If you get hurt, can you get back on the field and play? Do you play by the rules, let your body heal naturally? Or do you take drugs that are banned by the sports or that are illegal to allow yourselves to play? That's the temptation, I think, that athletes face constantly. Just a personal anecdote, because I feel like it. I was a pole vaulter in high school. Some of you know that. To pole vault successfully, you need to be strong in the upper body, and you need to have some speed. I didn't really have either, but I was scrappy. So I did work out constantly in high school, trying to increase my upper body strength. I did try to increase my speed, which I'm not gifted with. My friend and I worked out together. He's a pole vaulter as well. And in our junior year, he started taking steroids. Watched him shoot the stuff into his behind. And the dude's bench press went up about 100 pounds in a couple of months. And he buffed out. And he started bending the pole more. And in pole vaulting, your fiberglass pole is weighted to your body weight. And if you can bend a pole that's significantly more than your body weight, you can get hurled higher into the air. And he went up 20 or 30 pounds on a fiberglass pole based on the fact that he just blew up after taking steroids. And this was a while ago, admittedly. But so the advantages are real. And the ability to become an elite athlete is a temptation. And with the kind of money that's available in sports today, it's a difficult conundrum that these players face. Let me conclude by talking about the law before I turn the time to Mr. Silverman. Selling, possessing, or taking steroids is illegal. We get caught up in Barry Bonds, we get caught up in Roger Clemens. We don't always remember that it's an illegal substance. It's a controlled substance banned by the law. So individuals are not only cheating on the field, which is what gets us all fired up as fans, but they're also breaking the law. Federal law, in 1991, the Federal Anabolic Steroid Act was passed. Under this law, possession of steroids without a prescription is illegal and can result in fines and prison time. It's a schedule. It's anabolic steroids is Schedule 3 of the Controlled Substances Act. Simple possession carries a maximum penalty of 1 year in prison and a minimum $1,000 fine if this is an individual's first drug offense. The maximum penalty for trafficking is 5 years in prison and a fine of $250,000. The interesting thing here is that in sports, as the government and individuals have gone after steroid abusers, it's really been not so much under the controlled substances violations that these athletes have been getting busted out, but it's been under perjury. The government's been getting players that have perjured themselves, that have lied about taking it, and for some reason, which I honestly don't know the answer to, maybe we could talk about it in Q&A, the government hasn't been going after athletes for breaking the drug laws as much as going after high-profile athletes for perjuring themselves in lying about whether they did take these performance-enhancing drugs or not. Bottom line is this. We live in a society that values athletes in an extraordinary way. I spent the summer in Tokyo last year. I didn't see a single commercial that had an athlete in it. I didn't see any billboards. Baseball is big in Tokyo. Sumo wrestling is big in Tokyo. It was really weird for me to spend time in a place that didn't obsess over our sports and our athletes. There is an enormous temptation in this country to become an elite star athlete. And the temptations are real. The drug use benefits those players that take them. And it's a significant problem that I hope we can get into and discuss further today. Thank you.
Next, we're going to hear from Larry Silverman.
I can't speak sitting down. I apologize. I want to, first of all, thank Stacy and the law school for inviting me. This is a subject that I will make clear from the outset that I am very, very biased on this subject. I'm one of those people who not only loves baseball, I'm sort of the George Will, Roger Angel, wax eloquent, get all misty-eyed about baseball. You couple that with now working in the game for 6 years, and there hasn't been a day, I think, in the last 6 years that I haven't been maddeningly frustrated about the attention that baseball has received, the negative attention that baseball has received, particularly with regards to the other sports, over the issue of steroids. I am not going to stand here and tell you that baseball is blameless and that there was not a problem and that there may still be a problem to some degree. But I think it's been overblown. I think baseball has suffered a bum rap. I think to the extent that there was a problem, blaming owners, blaming managers, blaming coaches is misguided. I'm not here about blaming the players who Jay represents, but we do have something called personal responsibility in this country, and no one forced players to break the law. I think the examples that were given by Professor Cummings do show that there's temptations for all of us to do things that are illegal. And so to the extent that they were done by players, to blame ownership and to suggest that they knew it was going on, which I didn't read 1 ounce of proof of that allegation in the Mitchell report, I think is unfair, misguided, and really is the kind of thing that, as I said, has driven me to distraction over the last few years. What I want to try to do in light of that is not focus as much, maybe it's not as interesting, but nevertheless I'm going to do it, not focus as much on the failures of baseball, and I'm going to speak about baseball because it's the sport I know. I'm not familiar enough with the drug policies in other sports. But rather I want to talk a little bit about what baseball has done, both before they had cooperation from the union, since they have had cooperation from the union, and since the Mitchell Report recommendations came out. A little bit of history is necessary in order to do this right. And most of what I'm telling you is coming out of the Mitchell Report, which I fortunately or fortunately enough, or unfortunately enough, lived with. The Mitchell, as you know, Senator Mitchell was asked by Commissioner Seelig to hopefully put this issue to bed. I think it's fair to say that part of the charge was unsuccessful. But what the report did do over a year-and-a-half period was interview over 700 people. At my club alone, I can tell you that we had, I think it was about 22 people interviewed. I was involved in those interviews as because they were current employees of the club. They were not under oath, which, some people might say have argued that people were just free to lie. I didn't have the impression that these people were lying. They were mostly management people, coaches, trainers, front office personnel. Players were rarely interviewed because they didn't agree to be interviewed by the Mitchell Committee. And I can tell you that during the course of those interviews, while some people stated that they suspected that there were some people on their club using steroids, not a single person stated, I knew that somebody was using. This was, as is the title of Barry Bonds' book, something that went on in the shadows. I don't think it was as out in the open as somehow has been suggested. In addition to interviewing, and this went on with every club, and I know that because we had conference calls among the club lawyers every single week, 1 o'clock Thursday on the calendar, and then we'd get a memoranda after the meeting, and it would always crack me up because it would start out by saying, the 51st conference call was held between club council, because that's how many there was before we were done. So that it was we produced thousands and thousands of documents. There were a lot of interesting legal issues that I won't bore you with about confidentiality and what medical records could be produced and the like. We could all go to sleep on that one, but it was a lot of interesting stuff, expensive. We managed to keep it in-house in our club because we're a small market, and so we didn't hire outside counsel, but a lot of clubs did. And I think that one of the things that again, at the risk, and I guess I'm probably going to do this even though I said I wasn't, at the risk of placing blame here, again, we need to focus on what, for example, the Mitchell Report said. Whereas every club produced 20 to 25 people from the front office, coaching staff, etc. The commissioner's office produced over 16 witnesses, including the commissioner and his second in charge and the club and the lead counsel for Major League Baseball. I want to read to you what the Mitchell Report said about the Players Association. It's on page 7 of the report. The Players Association was largely uncooperative. It rejected totally my requests for relevant documents. It permitted one interview with its executive director, Donald Fear. My request for an interview with its chief operating officer, Gene Orza, was refused. It refused my request to interview the director of the Montreal laboratory that analyzes drug tests under baseball's drug program, but permitted her to provide me with a letter addressing a limited number of issues. I sent a memorandum to every active Major League Baseball player, encouraging each player to contact me or my staff if he had any relevant information. The Players Association sent out a companion memorandum that effectively discouraged players from cooperating. Not one player contacted me, in response to my memorandum. I received allegations of the illegal possession or use of performance-enhancing substances by a number of current players. Through their representative, the Players Association, I asked each of them to meet with me so that I could provide them with information about the allegations and give them a chance to respond. Almost without exception, they declined to talk to me. Another point I think that needs to be emphasized, and again, it was one of the things that frustrated me over the last 6 years. The talk shows would always state, hey, Barry Bonds is blameless. We had a talk show host in Pittsburgh that likes to be a contrarian, so he would always take the Barry Bonds side. And he'd say he's blameless because prior to 2002, steroids weren't illegal in baseball, which is absolutely ridiculous. And it was a commonly held misconception because there was no testing. And I remember reading this report, and those of you who have copies will notice that on page 10 of the summary that I gave you, there's a part crossed out. And the reason that's crossed out was because as I was reading the report, I wrote "finally" next to that. Because what was said by Senator Mitchell was, quote, "Many have asserted that steroids and other performance-enhancing substances were not banned in Major League Baseball before the 2002 Basic Agreement. This is not accurate. Beginning in 1971 and continuing today, Major League Baseball's drug policy has prohibited the use of any prescription medication without a valid prescription. By implication, this prohibition applied to steroids even before 1991, when Commissioner Faye Vincent expressly included steroids in baseball's drug policy. Steroids have been listed as a prohibited substance under the Major League drug policy since then." So that's what we had prior to 2002. And as Mitchell points out, prior to 2002, when the players agreed to testing of sort, they agreed to have testing done to determine whether there was a problem, and then if the testing showed a certain percentage of players tested positive, then they would agree to full-blown testing, which in fact happened. But prior to 2002, the Players Association opposed any drug program. This is again quoting Senator Mitchell. They opposed any drug program that included mandatory testing, despite several proposals for such a program from different commissioners. The effect of the players' opposition was to delay the adoption of mandatory drug testing in Major League Baseball for nearly 20 years. Now, in fairness, the Mitchell report also notes that while the owners did put a drug testing proposal on the table in 1994, the Mitchell report concluded that it was not a high priority item. I think the owners in 94, if you'll recall, that was the first time they proposed a salary cap, and that proposal eventually led to the strike in August and the shutting down of baseball. So the Mitchell report is critical of the owners for not pushing back in 94 a little harder. But there were proposals on the table that were consistently rejected, really until Congress got involved. And then finally, I think the union had no choice, and we had testing. What Major League Baseball has done since testing, first of all, they unilaterally imposed testing on the minor leagues because you could do that because unless you're on the 40-man roster, you are not protected by the Basic Agreement. So as far back as 2001, Major League Baseball did impose drug testing on non-40-man players, and in fact, it became the model for the Major League drug testing program. Beginning in 2005, there has been testing of all 40-man players. The effect, as the Mitchell report concludes, is that there's been a marked decline in steroid use, although they point out that HGH, because it can't be tested, may be continuing. Although interestingly, and I think I included in the materials, there is now a blood test that the Olympics is going to use for HGH. And I'm sure on the horizon we're going to have an issue when that drug test becomes more commercially available, that whether or not the players are going to agree to blood tests for HGH. And I must admit, I think it's a lot different than a urine test. It's invasive, and I'm not even sure where I stand on that one. Mitchell report also concludes that as a result of the 05 MLB policy, that the penalties for positive drug tests under the Major League program are the strongest of any major professional sport. I don't think you'll ever hear that on ESPN. We only hear about baseball. We don't hear about football. We don't hear about basketball. These football players just got to be 300 pounds just by magic. Today, what we have is an extensive program. This is my demonstrative evidence. I learned this in law school. I actually have to create a little notebook because of all the various memoranda and policies I get. Seemingly every day there's a new one put out by Major League Baseball. Don't let me forget this. Part of my job is to make sure we're in compliance. Fortunately, I delegate a lot of the nitty-gritty work, like going down and standing outside a urinal while a player provides the urine for the test. I don't do that, but I make sure somebody else does that. Recently, there's been a new agreement which, first of all, under the old agreement, there was, for the last couple of years, that every single player was subject to at least one random drug test during the season and one in the off-season. Under this new agreement, they've added 600 tests, which will mean that there'll be an average of 3 random drug tests per player per season. And they've doubled the amount of off-season testing, which is very expensive because they're keeping track of the players and making sure you know where they are, especially in light of how many Dominican and Venezuelan and other foreign players we have is quite a chore. The discipline I think everybody's familiar with for performance-enhancing substance, 50 games for the first, 100 games for the second, a ban if you're caught a third time, although you can apply for reinstatement after 2 years. For the first time, maybe 2 years ago, I think, stimulants were added to the list of banned substances, so-called greenies, which anybody who's followed baseball maybe read Jim Bouton's book years ago, Ball 4. It's been said that it was rampant. The penalties are a little less. You get counseling for the first offense, 25 games for the second. Mike Cameron, a pretty prominent player, is serving his penalty right now. 80 games for the third and a ban on the fourth. One of the things that stimulants has brought is there's been an epidemic of sorts of players claiming that they have adult ADD, because one of the remedies for that is Ritalin, and maybe there's other drugs too. That's the most prominent one. I think the Mitchell report even noted that in the population as a whole, it's maybe 1 or 2%. Among players, it's 10%. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And so they've tightened the rules significantly. It used to be if you had a prescription from any doctor, that would get you the exemption because Ritalin will cause a positive test for stimulants. Now they've provided a very definite list of doctors from whom you have to get certification before you can then seek the exemption. You have to reapply every year. It's going to be tougher. We'll see if the numbers drop. Another of the new things that was done unilaterally after the Mitchell report is that there now will be background checks done on all employees who spend a significant portion of their time in the clubhouse, trainers, strength and conditioning coaches, video coordinators, the traveling secretary, nutritionists, team doctors. All will be subject to background checks. The fear being, I think, that they may have been the source in some instances of steroids getting in the clubhouse. These same employees, with the exception of the independent contractors, will be subject to up to 4 random drug tests a year. I think, frankly, that we were told this list was for this year and that it may expand. I'm not on the list, but I suspect someday I will be, which is fine. One of the other new rules that came out of the Mitchell report, it was a recommendation that was adopted, had to do with disclosure to break down the so-called wall of silence. A hotline was developed that players, management, anybody can call if they have information. It's all anonymous. It would appear that an Atlanta Brave prospect got caught up in that because he, a fellow, I think his name is Schaefer, was recently suspended for 50 games for using HGH, and since there's no test, somebody had to, apparently somebody told on him, if you will. Part of that, too, is that a new Department of Investigations was created, whose job it is to investigate these kinds of complaints and also other things like allegations of gambling, and other issues that involve the integrity of the game. And I can tell you that I know the fellow, they got all these former FBI guys that head up these, and I met this gentleman during the All-Star game, and, these guys are serious. These are real cops. These are not, this is real stuff. The new agreement that just came out also added an independent program administrator who is protected from dismissal. It calls for more transparency by the issuance of annual reports, requires educational programs be developed. The players who were named in the report are actually required to participate. The union has agreed to submit $200,000 to education, and interestingly, I am almost done, the 200 top draft picks, or people proposed draft picks in the amateur draft, will be subject to testing. It's going to be interesting how they choose that, and I will be very surprised, and maybe Jay can address this if there's not a challenge to that, because they're not members of the union, that's for sure. They're high school kids in a lot of cases. I think, basically, let me just wrap up by saying this. The so-called steroid era, which went on in the 90s and early 2000s, I think is pretty much over. I'm sure there are players that are still using. I'm sure there are players that are still cheating, but it is not rampant. The sad part for me is that I think every single player has been stained to some degree. Because since there was no testing, and I think this was really where but I wish the union had been thinking this way, is that now, even those players who are clean, there's always this suspicion. I have an 11-year-old son. I mean, every time he'll see a player on TV, did Alex Rodriguez use steroids? Or he asked me the other day when the Pirates were playing Cincinnati, did Ken Griffey use steroids? I don't know what to say to him, because we don't know. I say, well, I've never heard an allegation, although now Jose Canseco said he was at a party and was talking to somebody who told somebody that somebody was talking to Rodriguez, and Rodriguez told somebody, and after the seventh level of hearsay, I got lost, and so I guess now Rodriguez is tainted. Albert Pujols, there was a story that he was going to be included in the Mitchell report a day or two before. He was not. I know he was, I think it was some talk show host in St. Louis. So it's really been a PR nightmare for baseball, but I think it is now changed. I'd like to see the media move on. Probably won't. But again, I warned you at the outset that I was biased. So thank you for your attention.
Now we will hear from Jay Reisinger.
I, unlike Larry, don't need to stand and first set. And you will be happy to know that in comparison to many negotiations that I've had with Larry over the years, that actually was very short. Professor Cummings raised an interesting issue when, and I'm going to stay away from my handout materials for a second and just to address a couple points that were raised in both Professor Cummings' presentation and Mr. Silverman's presentation. Professor Cummings raised the issue, what would you do if you had a pill and you could make yourself smarter and you could come to the top of your class. What would you do if you had a pill but you knew it had certain side effects? How many of you know generally the breakdown of the race and country of origin of the players that have tested positive in Major League Baseball under the testing program between 2005 and 2008? It's not generally white Americans. Overwhelmingly, those players that have been testing positive are Dominicans, Venezuelans, and they come from a different socioeconomic background. And I also would like you to focus a little bit about, and I've included some of that in my handout materials, about who the players are that are testing positive and that are getting caught. Derek Jeter is not getting caught. Alex Rodriguez is not getting caught. It's the Juan Salases of the world. It's the Nefi Perez's of the world. It is guys on the fringe. Those are the people that are getting caught. Now, sure, once in a while you have a big name like Roger Clemens or Andy Pettitte, but for the most part, it is not your more educated white baseball player that is getting caught. And again, much like Larry, most of my experience has been in the baseball arena, so that's what I'm going to tend to focus on. I also found it interesting that Professor Cummings raised the issue of sumo wrestlers. And since we're talking about how dangerous these substances are and how they can shorten your lives, the average age of a sumo wrestler, I believe, the average age of their death is under 40 because of what they do to their bodies. So it's not just steroids. There are other things that can kill you too, such as eating too much. Larry raised a couple interesting points with respect to the Mitchell report, and for better or for worse, I represented about 10 people. I think it was 10, maybe it was 11. I lost track. Who were subject to Mitchell's inquiries, and there was a big distinction between those people that Larry mentioned that were interviewed under his watch, club officials, club employees, et cetera, and current players. Current players are protected by the collective bargaining agreement and the rules and rights they're under that were collectively bargained for by the clubs and the Players Association. So they exercise their rights under the collective bargaining agreement not to be interviewed. To call that uncooperative, I think, is unfair. They wanted the right to interview these players anytime they wanted to. They should have bargained for it. They didn't do it. The more interesting aspect of the Mitchell report, and I represented a couple former players I represented a number of former players that were no longer club employees, and I also represented a number of people that are former players that were club employees. Now, if you're a former player and a club employee, you had very little choice but to show up and be interviewed. Otherwise, you were going to get terminated. The club had the right to terminate you if you failed to show and you were a club employee. But think about this. If the law school came knocking on your door and said, we have an allegation that you smoked marijuana. They didn't tell you who it came from. They didn't tell you anything about the nature of it, when it happened, where it happened, didn't provide you any documents, and said, we would like you to come in and give an interview that is not protected or legally privileged in any way, shape, or form. Would you do it? Absolutely not. There is no way a law student sitting here would do that. It doesn't matter how innocent you are. It's violative. So you're not going to do it. So to say that the players, former players, current players were uncooperative, I don't think that's exactly fair. What they were asking these players to do was to come in without providing, forget due process. It didn't exist in this process. But they would not provide you any documents. They would not tell you who provided the information. And to subject your client to that, it would be malpractice. And that's why I advised my clients that had a choice, that were former players that were no longer in the game or current players, that they shouldn't participate in those interviews. So I would comment on that on the Mitchell report. Larry also raised an interesting point about the new Department of Investigations. And for those of you who wonder, the number to call is 1-888-REPORT-to-MLB. So if you want to write that down and turn in anybody, you should feel free. I don't know whether Jordan Schaefer, who's a top prospect in the Atlanta Braves organization, was actually caught up. I know he was caught up by the Department of Investigations, Major League Baseball's guys that are running that. And Larry is right. The individuals that are running the Department of Investigations do have pretty significant credentials, and they're not the rent-a-cops that police the football games and the basketball games here and in Heinz Field. But that will raise some interesting questions going forward. I'm a little bit concerned about it. You've got a player, who is alleged. There is no allegation that he used HGH, just merely that he possessed it. It's a non-analytical positive, which I outlined in the materials that I handed out. But the commissioner has the right. Well, he was suspended under the minor league program because he's not on the 40-man roster. But had he been a major league player, and I had a couple of these that happened this year that I don't outline in my material since the information that I have is protected by the attorney-client privilege. But you did have a number of players, specifically Jay Gibbons of the Baltimore Orioles this year, that was suspended for what's called a non-analytical positive, which means he didn't test positive for a banned substance. It was merely alleged that he possessed it at some point during the years in question, and therefore was suspended. What documentation they had, regarding his possession of it, I'm not really sure, but that can happen. You can get suspended for what's called a non-analytical positive. I do think it'll be a cold day in hell before the union agrees to a blood test for human growth hormone, but that remains to be seen. I do agree with Larry to an extent that congressional pressure has led to changes in the drug agreement between the Players Association and Major League Baseball. At the end of the day, Larry and I do salary arbitration. And in baseball and salary arbitration, a player submits a number, the club submits a number, you either settle it or it goes to hearing, and the panel of arbitrators can pick one number. And it's just like taking a case to a jury or a judge. Once you submit it and you go to that panel of arbitrators, you've lost all control over the case. And you put it in the hands of the arbitrators. Well, Larry and I have been, I would say, pretty successful. In fact, completely successful in negotiating our arbitration-eligible clients so that we come to an agreement, and we don't have to put the decision in the hands of a third party. I think by agreeing to the programs and the progression of the revised programs, what the Players Association and Major League Baseball have done is avoided Congress coming in and imposing their will. And I think to that extent, they both ought to be congratulated, because it's always better to control it than have Congress control it, that's for sure. So with that, I'll turn very quickly to the handout materials that I had submitted to you. And we'll just run through a couple of them real quickly. Most of you know the Jay Gibbons story, and he recently, as part of the agreement that was reached on Thursday, Mr. Gibbons' 15-game suspension will be reduced to 0, so he's not actually going to get punished. But unfortunately, I'd already put this together before that happened. So we talked about the next one is Juan Salas. Salas is a relief pitcher for the Tampa Bay Devil Rays, tested positive for a banned substance, specifically a steroid, and was violated for 50 games. I do not believe a grievance was filed in that case. He was one of the first ones subject to the revised penalties that included the 50-game suspension. Mike Cameron, as Larry mentioned, was an outfielder for the San Diego Padres, was suspended for 25 games, which indicates that Mr. Cameron has tested positive twice for stimulants. It should also be noted it was at least publicly reported that Mr. Cameron had applied for a TUE, which is a therapeutic use exemption, which Mr. Silverman also mentioned with respect to guys with ADD and how the rate in baseball seems to be a little bit higher than it is in the rest of the population. But I don't know whether Mr. Cameron has been granted a TUE, but Adderall, Ritalin can have an amphetamine. Well, they are amphetamines. So that's Mike Cameron. Of course, a lot of you heard about Nephew Perez, who was suspended for 80 games as the result of a third test. One of the more interesting cases, and this came up a long time ago, so it didn't get a lot of airplay, but it got some, was Mike Morse. Mike Morse was a minor league infielder in the Seattle Mariners system who tested positive not once but twice under the minor league system. And this was back before the major league system was he tested positive twice before there was a 10-game suspension for a first-time positive in the major leagues. Cameron is in the minor leagues, tests positive not once but twice. And he can show on his second positive test that the amount of steroids in his bloodstream had dropped significantly. Therefore, he could show that he had not used since he was originally tested. He then gets called up by the big league club in August or September. He is tested again under the major league policy, and he tests positive a third time. And again, they take a look at his blood test, and they show a decreased amount of steroids in his system, showing that he had not used a separate time. Regardless, the arbitrator found that, again, Major League Baseball and the Players Association didn't adequately address this in the collective bargaining agreement, the 2002 to 2006 agreement, and said basically, tough luck, Mr. Morse. The rules are the rules. Subsequently, the collective bargaining agreement was amended so that situations like Mr. Morse's don't happen again. They have to show, in order to suspend you for a second, third, or fourth time, they have to show a subsequent and independent use from the original usage that caused the first positive test. With that, I just put a couple other, examples in here regarding other athletes and other tests, Jose Theodore, Tammy Thomas, just so you can see how it works in other sports. But with that, I'll open it up, and if we want to have Q&A.
At this time, we're going to take questions from the audience, but we just ask that you wait for Brandon to reach you with the microphone. We are recording this, so we'd like to be able to hear your question on the video recording. So, anybody have questions? Professor Roberts?
Thank you all for coming to the West Virginia community and sharing with us all of your expertise in this area. I'm not an expert in the area, but I was wondering a little bit more about the Ritalin and the TUEs, I guess the exemptions. It sounded like, to the extent that you think players are saying that they have ADD, they're saying that so that they can get this exemption status. But what it made me think of is that Professor Cummings' original example about whether students would contemplate certain advantages. Apparently, the Pulitzer Prize has been talking about whether or not academics of various sorts are utilizing certain drugs, including something like Ritalin and other drugs that might make you stay up all night. And so these kinds of advantages, I think, already are out there, some of them legal and some of them not. And so I was wondering, in the sports world, would drugs like Ritalin have a benefit? They might have a benefit to people in the academic world, but it sounded like you guys weren't talking about any kind of enhancement that's received, but instead it's just the incentive to have the TUE or the exemption.
I don't know. I think that there is an enhancement in the sense, just like student because you have more energy. You don't, sports, it's a grind, especially as you get near the end of the season. Those are the stories you would always hear in baseball. But that's when players would use more often than not to, sort of get through the season. So I think in that sense, I don't think it makes you faster. It certainly doesn't make you stronger, but the mental side of the game and being sharp is critical too, and it certainly helps in that regard.
I agree with Larry. I don't view it as a performance, and I don't put it in the same category at all with human growth hormone, which, by the way, I want to make perfectly clear is legal in the United States with a prescription. But it's not in the same category. But again, it is a 162-game season. Sometimes these guys are playing 5 games in a row. It does get to be a drag. Now players have turned their attention to cases of Red Bull, and they're drinking about 10 before every game. I'm not exactly sure that's any safer than taking that, but there has been, at least it's been publicly reported, an increase in requests for TEWEs for adult attention deficit disorder. So.
I believe we have a question here in the back from Phil Eastep.
Thank you also for coming. I was wondering if you could touch on, I know you mentioned like Latin American players, foreign players that I guess have been the higher percentage of players that have gotten caught, but could you touch on, I guess, American players, mainly the difference, maybe the percentages in black Americans and white Americans that have been caught, and if you feel like mainly the difference between the Latin American players was maybe the language barrier or, I guess, poverty in their country, or what the reasons are that they are the highest percentage of players being caught?
I just so everybody's clear what I do. I work for a law firm, but I work as outside counsel to a number of different sports agencies. I am a certified agent, but I don't do very much negotiation unless it's with Larry. But the thing that you have to understand about Dominican players and Venezuelan players is a lot of them support their entire families. Okay, and so you'll have, the Juan Salas, and I don't know Juan Salas, don't represent him, never met the guy. But a lot of my Dominican clients support their entire families, and that may be from 10 to 25 people that they support. And Juan Salas being in the major leagues, making $410,000 a year is a lot different than Juan Salas making $100,000 a year. And so I do think that there is an increased financial temptation for a player such as Mr. Salas and some of the other players that have been caught to use so that they can stay in the major leagues, if indeed that's why they're using. Some of them are also extraordinarily scared of injury. Some of them think, some mistakenly think that it wards off injury. There is also a problem with what's known as Biscone, specifically in the Dominican. Biscone, most of you wouldn't know what that is, but Biscone are essentially amateur agents that run around the Dominican Republic grabbing 15 and 16-year-olds and bringing them to camps and telling them how to get big. And you also have to understand that steroids are available over the counter in the Dominican, Mexico. It's pretty easy to obtain. It's not the same as here in the United States. So I think both the Players Association and to a lesser extent Major League Baseball have stepped up and tried to give more education to the Latin American players so that mistakes aren't made. They're not buying the wrong things. And I do think that that's a problem. And I do think that a number of the players that have tested positive, the Latin American players that have tested positive, did so unwittingly and unknowingly. But that's my opinion.
Drew Parsons is up. I believe his performance in the 5K this weekend may warrant some sort of testing itself.
I'll employ Mr. Rasinger for that. I'm curious as to know what, if any, effect this era of impropriety, let's call it, has had on players' ability to get endorsements, advertising, shoe labels. If any of the panelists know, has it made it easier or harder for them, having that suspicion on them, or I guess I'm after like, I guess I see that as a ipso facto popular opinion poll as to what people respond to. Like if they say, oh, this guy is taking steroids, we can't endorse him, we can't let him make any endorsements. Has that happened?
Well, on that point, everybody should understand this. In Major League Baseball, there are maybe 5% of the players that have national endorsement deals. So big endorsement deals for Major League Baseball players don't exist. It's not like football. It's not like basketball, you know, when you have a $20 million Nike shoe deal. Guys in Major League Baseball don't have that. Has it had an effect? Yeah. Barry Bonds lost a ton of sponsors. But more importantly, and I note this in my materials, I think it has an effect once a player is tested positive, at least for a first time for steroids or a second time for stimulants, because major league clubs are not aware under the stimulant policy that they've tested positive. So if somebody on the Indians has tested positive, Larry's not aware of that. But what happens is Mike Cameron, for example, had tested positive. It became public. Mike Cameron was a free agent this year. Do I think that that affected Mike Cameron's value on the free agent market? Absolutely, because a team signing him up to a long-term contract is going to run the risk that they're going to lose the player for 80 games. Now, it is an unpaid suspension, and that needs to be made clear, but at the same time, you're without your starting center fielder for 80 games, regardless of whether you have to pay him. And it's not like you can take his salary and go buy someone of Mike Cameron's, you know, ability and stick him in center field for the 80 games that he's gone. So I do think that it does have a dramatic impact on a player's marketability in the free agent and the salary arbitration marketplace. I mean, I can tell you that Guillermo Mota, when he tested positive 2 years ago, Guillermo Mota was a free agent following the 2006 season, tested positive, was announced right after the World Series, right before the World Series, right after the playoffs. Tested positive. He was still able to secure a contract, but it certainly wasn't in the realm of what he probably would have been looking at had he not tested positive. So there is a marketplace correction for the mistakes that these players make.
I know that Jay, the one player, Pirate player that we did settle in arbitration last year, I quoted or I cited a comparable salary of a relief pitcher who had tested positive. And I know Jay and his team argued vociferously that that salary was artificially low and that I shouldn't count it as a comparable because he tested positive. But, you know,
I was right. But
you know, whether an arbitrator, it's an interesting question, whether an arbitrator in a salary arbitration context would punish a player. There's certainly, that is a criteria in the salary arbitration process that you're allowed to bring up these sort of public appeal personality factors. It's usually a statistics game, but when you have a player who has had some off-the-field problems, you know, citizenship problems, if you will, you know, it's done. Certainly the players, when they are good citizens, will use that fact to try to, you know, enhance their value in arbitration. So I think it probably would be a relevant factor and, you know, probably should be a relevant factor. Assuming that there was a positive test and that the player had, you know, violated the rules, I think that does go to his public appeal, and I think in arbitration it is relevant. I argued otherwise, but you know, fortunately I had other comparables and we were able to settle.
Wouldn't you agree with me, though, that Mike Cameron's free agent value was affected by that positive test?
I can't remember what Cameron signed for, to be honest with you. I know Eric Gagne didn't
You only
do
got 1
badly,
year.
considering Gagne's performance. More than anything else, it's amazing that he got a contract at all. I thought Mota signed for a high number. When you mentioned Mota, he wasn't available. He wasn't available to pitch, if I recall, because of his suspension until maybe mid-May.
That's correct.
And he still got $2.5 million that started at that point. So if you prorate that over the season, and I don't think Moda's numbers were all that terrific either. So I think that most clubs are going to.
For the record, Larry thinks every player is overpaid.
Overpaid and not that terrific. One thing to keep in mind, Drew and others, is I think one of the most remarkable stories of the season is that Barry Bonds is still sitting at home. Are you telling me there's not a team that could use a designated hitter that hit 28 or 30 home runs last year? I mean, the taint of steroids on Barry Bonds' career has been devastating, and I'm sure both Jay and Larry have opinions on this subject. But Hall of Fame, we're talking about at least 3 or 4 surefire Hall of Famers: Roger Clemens, Sammy Sosa, Barry Bonds, that now, may not be in the Hall, depending on what the voters decide. And so, as far as endorsements in baseball, that's a much different animal than endorsements in football or basketball. But the effect that it will have on their long-term, legacy and their ability to make money on that. I mean, think about Arnold Palmer and Jack Nicklaus still make, millions of dollars, and these athletes in baseball that are tainted are not going to have that opportunity.
Yeah, and that hopefully is what will cause, in part, when people have the choice that you talked about, not to use. As far as Bonds goes, I think in Bonds' case, it's more the circus that he brings to any club that would sign him. I mean, the stories you hear about what went on in San Francisco are just amazing. I mean, it was a circus, and it's very tough for a team for the other 24 players to deal with that. So Bonds has been hurt, I'm sure, financially, obviously, and otherwise, and we'll see what happens if he's acquitted. I think there might be almost like what happened with Kobe Bryant, a period of time when he's shunned, but then, Kobe's recovered fairly nicely.
Well, I think that Barry's his situation's a little bit different. And it's not, I mean, people have been certainly talking about the fact that he could have been on steroids for many years. But the fact is he's now under federal indictment, and I think that makes it slightly different. I mean, certainly there have been whispers about other players that have been, big-name players that have been able to get contracts. And I also don't think that Barry Bonds at this point in his career is willing to play for $1 million either. So what we don't know is what his current demands are. I mean, we've certainly had players that have chosen retirement over a couple $1 million to come out and play. So that may be an issue here. But I think the indictment is probably more of the impediment than the allegations of steroid use in Bonds' case.
We have a question here in the front. Mr. Dixon.
My question was, Major League Baseball is very unique because of its access to high school talent versus some of the other leagues where these guys must wait a little bit longer. What are the preparation efforts or the prevention efforts of the league or individual clubs in making sure that these younger athletes are aware of what the policies are and how they should, what substances they can and can't take? What efforts, if any, do they have when they come in at such a young age for Major League Baseball?
Well, I think part of the new agreement, which unfortunately all I've seen is a press release, but apparently, and it was certainly a big focus of the Mitchell report, is there's a real emphasis on the need for education and making sure that the dangers are well known and that that the benefits don't outweigh the harm. Once a player is signed in baseball, they almost always go into the minor league system, and I know that we have our new farm director this year put together a guidebook. It's a really very nicely put together document which describes all the rules that a player is subject to. It's actually terrific. I don't, among them would be those. I know that every spring, this has gone on for several years, a video, I've sat through some of them, are shown to the minor league players. And again, some of these are kids discussing not only drugs, but being careful about gambling, being careful about the old expression that very little good happens after midnight when you're drinking, and I guess Pac-Man Jones didn't read that, but so there is an effort to do that, and hopefully they've been watching the news too, and they've seen what's going on. So it's pretty hard. I would hope that at this point at least there's an awareness, and now that needs to be followed up with concrete education, which again I gather is part of this new agreement.
As it stands right now, there is no program for the top 200 guys for them to come into a room like this and have a Major League Baseball official read to them the list of prohibited substances, and this is what you can and cannot do. Again, draft-eligible players coming out of high school or even college are not subject to the collective bargaining agreement. But they did include this new provision that the top 200 prospects, as I think it's just listed by Baseball America, the top 200 prospects will be subject to drug tests. But as far as a comprehensive program, right now it doesn't exist as far as the education of the high school athlete, at least by Major League Baseball or the Players Association.
I have a question. What, if any, place in sports do you think that Congress has? And if Congress hadn't stepped in Major League Baseball, do you think that officials and other people would have continued to turn a blind eye, or would it have eventually worked itself out as far as testing goes, or stricter testing?
I think this is one place we do agree. I don't think that we would have the kind of comprehensive testing program in Major League Baseball but for the threat that Congress would impose, whether it was the Olympic rules, which are even harsher, or other sanctions on the sport. Again, I'm not. Believe me, my politics are generally on the union side of things, and I don't mean to sound sarcastic about the union. This is a very, very, very strong union that protects its players, that knows where its obligations lie. I think, though, my only point was, and I'll make it again, is that there was a point when they were actually hurting the very people that they are charged with protecting. And I think that was when maybe they decided that we're going to stop objecting to the owner's proposals for drug testing, and we're going to agree. And certainly Congress getting involved had a lot to do with that.
I agree, but in the fact that congressional pressure certainly was the impetus behind the numerous changes that have occurred to the drug agreement over the past 4 years. I don't think that Congress has any role in legislating drug testing in professional sports. I think, quite frankly, they have better things to do that they're not doing. However, they've picked this up. It's a very popular topic. It gets on TV, and they decided to make a showing of it. And I think to some extent in this last round it kind of backfired on them because it was just so ridiculous. But look, I feel terrible about and I was there in 2005, and I was back there again this year, and you hear the stories about the teenagers that commit suicide because apparently they were taking too many steroids. And look, if your child has to look to Barry Bonds or to Albert Pujols, somebody to be their role model, that's a problem in your house. I mean, I have a 4-year-old son, and my 4-year-old son, I pray to God, isn't going to grow up and take steroids. But that's my responsibility as his father. And I don't see why Congress needs to impose that on the players or Major League Baseball.
Interestingly, and I think Jay and Larry both spoke to this, the last congressional hearing was a spectacle, and most of the congresspersons, to me at least, and those of you that watched it may agree, were grandstanding and throwing sound bites. And this is a labor law issue. This is a collectively bargained. One of the things that's very interesting to me, and I've written about the commercialization of collegiate sports recently. I talk about the obsession that we as Americans have with professional sports and collegiate sports as well. But as Jay said, this is our Congress dealing with a game, and the inability, at least until recently, of the two sides to come to an agreeable position on drug testing. Jay mentioned his 4-year-old. Many of you may remember the Sports Illustrated story a few months ago of a father that was injecting his son with steroids to beef him up to, be an elite athlete. And you hear now stories of these sort of, years when I was growing up, it was Todd Marinovich's father who was like, making him throw the football every day at 5 a.m. And you hear about Andre Agassi's father that made him pick up a racket at 2 or whatever. But there's an obsession in our country with elite athletes and becoming one, and we need to take the personal responsibility, and there needs to be consequences, right, for a father that's injecting steroids into his son in junior high school and high school so that he can become a 300-pound offensive lineman.
Well, I think local law enforcement officials can take care of that. I mean, that's why we have child abuse laws. But I was talking to Larry before the session today, and I watched, was lucky enough that my client didn't have to testify this time in front of Congress. Andy Pettit didn't have to testify. So I was actually watching it from Florida when we were doing salary arbitration, so I got to watch the whole thing, got to watch the congressman and how full, you could see the panel behind it and how full the panel was. Every single congressman and woman was there getting ready to ask their questions and to get their little sound bites. I was home about a month ago for a day, had some minor surgery, and I'm sitting there watching TV, and I turned on C-SPAN, and there they have the 5 heads of the largest mortgage companies. Now, this is an issue that is a real issue that's affecting millions of Americans that are about to lose their homes because of bad loans. And I'm looking at the same committee, and I'm looking into the background when they show it, and there were about a quarter of the congressmen and women that were on that committee. And to me, that made me sick. I mean, the fact that they chose to be there for Roger Clemens and for Brian McNamee, but they couldn't be there to question and make inquiry of what I view to be one of the greatest financial crises of my short life, I think is repulsive.
Guys, thanks for coming again. In your opening remarks there, Mr. Silverman, talking, I think, kind of about the love of the game. And I just was curious to see or hear what you all have to say about things that aren't banned but really do enhance performance. And I think one of the obvious ones would be painkiller. There's athletes, and I don't know the baseball examples as well. I follow other sports more, but there's football players or hockey players that you can't perform without getting an injection in a joint or just like might be cortisone or anything else. I think there was a story last year about Randy Johnson getting injected into his knee, where he couldn't pitch if he didn't have this injected into his knee. And it seems like that obviously enhances performance, or at least lets you perform, but it's not banned. So I just wondered, for a purity sense, do you think that we should have, anything? Should you not be injecting B12? Should you not be injecting things that are legal? Should you not be taking Ritalin to have a pure sport? Or where's the line between something that's an illegal performance enhancer and something that's just, a prescription?
Well, I'd like to think that most team doctors are ethical, just like most doctors are ethical, and that they're taking into account the player's long-term health when they prescribe medications. I mean, pitchers are prescribed, Celebrex, sometimes prednisone, which is a steroid actually, although not an anabolic steroid. Look, we take, if you have a headache and you're going to take something for it so you can study. There's obviously a line. I do think that, it's like anything else that can be abused. I think in football, probably more than anywhere else, that players may be taking, playing longer than they should, hurting their future health. You watch a guy like Joe Namath walking around. But again, I think that really we need to have our doctors and team doctors do the right thing. I'm not sure we can legislate that. I guess that's really the issue, is that not everything can be legislated. Some things just have to be left to good common sense and the ethics of the people in the game, and I think that's an example. And I know baseball has tried. I've got a bunch of rules in here that deal with supplements because there's a fear that you can falsely test positive, so that there's only certain supplements are approved for use in the clubhouse, and they have to be certified by some outfit called EAS. I don't even know what EAS stands for.
It's a private company that you ought to get stock in.
Yeah. But what was interesting, our team owner was actually given a pamphlet the other day, and then he passed it on to me. It was a brochure by some company that made a juice that was, according to the pamphlet, had wonderful effects. In fact, it was endorsed by several Minnesota Twin players. They had endorsements in there, and he wanted basically us to pass it on to our trainers. I checked to see if it was on the list of approved supplements, and it was not. So we will, of course, not do that. And I wondered whether these endorsements were proper in light of that. And as baseball explained to me, their jurisdiction is limited. They can tell people, they can tell clubs, they can tell clubhouse managers, trainers, that only these EAS certified supplements can be allowed in the clubhouse or can be distributed by clubs. But if a player wants to go into a GNC and buy a supplement, it's not illegal in any way. And, again, there's only so much you can legislate. And hopefully they're using common sense. Hopefully that supplement is not harmful. Hopefully for them it won't cause a positive test either. But, there's just certain places, you can only go so far.
And the problem with the positive test is that you buy it from GNC or another reputable chain, and you don't retain. I've got a player right now who's in the middle of. We've just filed a grievance on his behalf. He bought a product that was actually endorsed on the Today Show. The Today Show had a snippet of this substance and how wonderful it was and how it made you lose weight, and it was great. Well, guess what? When you send it to the lab, it turns out that it has a very small trace amount of amphetamine in it. So here was a product being touted on the Today Show that was available, on the internet. Seemed to be a perfectly legitimate product. Of course, on the bottle when you receive it has nothing that says amphetamine on it. And I've got a player that's trip positive. Now, luckily enough, this player, as opposed to some other players, retained samples of this stuff. And so we were able to send it to a lab and found out that indeed it did have a trace of amphetamine in it. And, it's still in the grievance process. But, that's what can happen when you don't buy a supplement that is approved, and this could cause the player a significant problem.
At this time, we'd like to thank our panelists, and to show our appreciation, we'd like to present you with a gift. We believe this gift is a symbol of not only our law school, but our university and state as well. And we hope that when you see it in your office, you're able to look back at today and view it as an enjoyable experience.
Now, as a Pitt season ticket holder, how's this going to work for me?
Take one out. Take one out. Take one out.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
What's this guy? You guys are
going to get us killed. That's very nice. Thank you very much.